When people think about World War II, they picture armor columns, air raids, and decisive battles. What they rarely picture is cold as a strategic enemy, one that disabled divisions without firing a shot. Frostbite, trench foot, hypothermia, and exhaustion quietly removed hundreds of thousands of soldiers from the fight. And yet, when we talk about winter warfare, we often focus on heavy coats, thick blankets, or dramatic survival stories. That framing misses the real lesson. The most effective answer to cold in World War II was not bulk. It was not weight. And it was not the long greatcoat that dominates photographs. It was a thin, almost unimpressive garment that many soldiers underestimated at first, the insulated jacket liner. This liner, light, compressible, and designed to trap heat close to the body, did more to keep soldiers functional than any single outer coat. It represents a shift in military thinking that still shapes cold weather gear today, yet it's rarely discussed in detail. To understand why it mattered, you have to understand how armies misunderstood cold for centuries. For most of military history, warmth was treated as a matter of thickness and toughness. Before the 20th century, armies assumed warmth came from mass. Soldiers wore wool coats, layered tunics, and heavy cloaks. If you were cold, the solution was more fabric or, honestly, just heavier fabric. This approach made intuitive sense, but it ignored how the human body actually loses heat. Heat loss doesn't happen evenly. It escapes fastest where air circulates, where moisture accumulates, and where blood flow is restricted. Heavy outer garments often failed on all three fronts. They trapped moisture, restricted movement, and created gaps where cold air could circulate freely. In World War I, this misunderstanding became catastrophic. Soldiers standing in trenches wore thick wool uniforms that soaked through with sweat, rain, and snow. Once wet, wool stopped insulating effectively. Soldiers didn't just get cold, they stayed cold. By the time World War II began, militaries knew cold was dangerous, but many still believed the solution was simply better coats. World War II forced armies to confront cold as a systems problem, not just a clothing problem. The war expanded into environments where cold wasn't just seasonal, it was constant. Eastern Europe, the Ardennes, the Aleutian Islands, northern China, and the Alps all punished soldiers who were honestly just inadequately protected. Early campaigns showed a brutal pattern units with strong logistics, but poor thermal design collapsed just as quickly as poorly supplied ones. Medical reports began to highlight something, well, uncomfortable. Soldiers wearing heavy coats were still freezing. Meanwhile, some units with lighter clothing but better layering stayed operational longer. This pushed military planners toward a different idea. Warmth doesn't really come from outer armor against the cold. Instead, it comes from managing the air trapped next to the body. The thin liner worked because, well, it insulated the soldier, not the uniform itself. The jacket liner, often quilted, lightly padded and worn under a shell, did something truly revolutionary. It created a controlled layer of still air directly around the torso. This air warmed up quickly from body heat and, stayed warm because it wasn't exposed to wind. Unlike heavy coats, liners actually moved with the body. They didn't restrict the shoulders or compress insulation when a soldier bent, crawled, or marched. More importantly, they reduced the need for constant adjustment. Soldiers didn't have to open and close bulky coats all the time to regulate temperature. They could stay warm while active and avoid overheating, which often led to sweat and later on freezing. This really mattered because, well, moisture was actually the real enemy. Sweat that soaked into those heavy coats turned warmth into a liability, Liners, by contrast, allowed moisture to escape outward into the shell, preserving insulation exactly where it counted. Soldiers learned pretty quickly that the liner mattered more than whatever was worn over it. Field reports from multiple theaters describe, again and again, the same phenomenon. Soldiers would trade or even improvise liners, even when proper coats were unavailable. In some cases, troops wore liners under captured or mismatched outer garments, and, believe it or not, stayed warmer than those in regulation gear. Veterans later recalled that, once you had a good liner, the outer layer almost didn't matter, as long as it blocked wind. A thin shell, plus a liner, honestly, outperformed thick coats in real movement, real weather, and real fatigue. This was especially evident during prolonged operations. A soldier who stayed dry and warm at the core could function longer, think more clearly, and avoid the cascading failures that cold induced. Commanders noticed that units with better internal insulation suffered fewer cold casualties even in harsher conditions. The liner quietly changed how militaries thought about mobility and endurance. Heavy winter coats had always been a trade-off. Yes, they offered protection, but they slowed movement and increased exhaustion. Liners reduced that trade-off. Soldiers could carry less weight, move faster, and still survive extreme cold. This mattered operationally. In winter fighting, speed often meant survival. Units that could march longer without rest, dig without numb hands, and maintain weapon function had a decisive advantage. Cold really degrades fine motor skills before it incapacitates the whole body. Fingers lose dexterity, reloads slow down, and, mistakes just increase. Keeping the core warm actually delays that degradation. The liner did that better than any blanket or coat, simply because it addressed physiology, not appearance. Blankets were useful at rest, but they failed where combat actually happened. Blankets have an important place in survival, but not in movement. They work when you're stationary and dry. In combat, soldiers are rarely either. Blankets don't stay in place, don't regulate moisture, and they really don't integrate with equipment. Many armies issued blankets generously and coats sparingly, just assuming soldiers would wrap up when needed. In practice, this led to exposed torsos during movement and overheating during rest, exactly the opposite of what was needed. The liner replaced the blanket as a wearable solution. It traveled with the soldier, worked while active, and, didn't require stopping to deploy. That alone made it more valuable than any extra layer carried in a pack. The lesson of the liner extended far beyond World War II. Post-war military clothing systems across the world adopted the same principle, modular layering centered on insulation close to the body. Cold weather gear shifted from single heavy garments to integrated systems, base layer, insulating layer, and shell. Modern survival clothing, mountaineering gear, and even civilian outdoor jackets, they follow this logic almost exactly. Synthetic insulation, fleece, and lightweight down all trace their philosophy back to what the wartime liner proved. Warmth comes from managing air, moisture, and movement, not from piling on weight. The liner also influenced logistics. Lightweight insulation was easier to transport, issue, and replace. It reduced fatigue injuries and medical evacuations. Quietly, it became one of the highest impact pieces of non-weapon equipment in the war. What most people miss is that this was not a technological breakthrough, it was a conceptual one. The materials used in World War II liners were not advanced by modern standards. Cotton batting, early synthetics, and simple quilting did the job. What changed was the understanding of how humans interact with cold. Armies stopped asking, how thick should the coat be, and started asking, how do we keep the body stable across activity levels? That shift, honestly, saved lives. It also explains why some soldiers survived winters that really should have killed them, not because they were somehow tougher, but because their clothing worked with their biology instead of, against it. The real takeaway here is that cold warfare is won before the first shot is even fired. Weapons freeze, vehicles fail, morale collapses. Cold turns minor mistakes into fatal ones. The thin jacket liner didn't look heroic. It didn't feature in propaganda posters. But, well, it kept soldiers operational when everything else broke down. In World War II, that made it more effective than any blanket and, in many cases, more effective than the coat worn over it. It was a quiet solution to a loud problem, and it really reshaped how survival in extreme environments is understood. If there's a single lesson modern viewers should take from this, it's this. In hostile environments, the smartest solutions are often the least visible, and sometimes the thin layer you almost ignore is the one actually keeping you alive.